Hi, and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. How can Polyvagal Theory help us to understand our role as parents who are raising pathologically demand-avoidant children and teens? Hi, I'm Casey, founder of At Peace Parents, and I've helped hundreds of parents of pathologically demand-avoidant children and teens to stabilize their family and find peace along their unique journey with their children. So today, we're going to be talking about all things Polyvagal Theory, why it's important to understand as a parent, and how it can address some of our most complex paradoxical questions and things that we observe as parents. So here's where we're going today in this mini impromptu training on Polyvagal Theory and PDA. So we're going to talk briefly about how I define pathological demand avoidance from a brain and nervous system lens. We're going to talk about a little bit about what polyvagal theory is and how it's different than our previous understanding of the nervous system. And then I'm going to address 4 primary paradoxes that we observe as parents and that parents ask me when we're working together, which is, first, why do things seem to be getting worse even while I'm implementing all these nervous system supports, lowering demands, and accommodations? Why is my child more explosive or, quote, more defiant? Okay. Number 2, how can my PDA or just turn it on and off again if the behaviors we are observing are not under their conscious control, if they're truly nervous system responses? Number 3, how can equalizing behavior, which Casey, you say is nervous system driven, be social in nature if it's not actually under their conscious control? And then finally, maybe you're a family who's been here for a long time, so happy you're here, but you've been lowering demands, you've been accommodating, you've stabilized your family, and you truly feel at peace with the decisions you've made. Even if your life isn't necessarily easy, you feel at peace. However, as a mom in particular, you're probably asking, well, why do I still feel like such shit in my own nervous system? Why am I so anxious? Why am I having fight-flight reactions? Why did I actually kind of feel better when I was in survival mode myself and trying to get us out of the trauma cave? So we're going to address these all on this impromptu training. I will save this. If you're listening to it on the podcast, you already know I did. But let's get started without further ado. Okay, so how do I define pathological demand avoidance for the purposes of our work together as parents? So the way that I define pathological demand avoidance is as a nervous system disability, and it is when the survival drive for autonomy, meaning the subconscious perception of a loss of autonomy or equality, overrides other survival instincts that also come from that survival part of the brain, like eating, toileting, sleep, hygiene, and or safety. And within safety, we can consider things like self-harm or suicidal ideation. So it's not that a PDA child doesn't have other survival instincts. It's what makes it unique as a neurotype is that survival drive is so strong that can actually override hunger, right? Where if the child doesn't perceive on a subconscious level, like pre-perceptual, so a better word for it is actually neurocept, according to polyvagal theory, even if they have that survival drive for hunger, the perception of autonomy and equality will override the hunger if they're feeling like they do not have a choice, right? Whereas for most humans and individuals, their nervous system, the hunger will kick in over the need for autonomy or equality, okay? So Casey, how is this different from trauma or another hypersensitive nervous system that many of us have as parents, that many of us have as neurodivergent humans, whether we're ADHD, whether we're autistic, non-PDA autistic, or even myself, I would consider to have a highly sensitive nervous system. So what makes it different than a PDA brain? Okay, so here's how I want you guys to think about it. What the brain, the survival part of the brain, is scanning for as threat that will trigger the panic response in the nervous system is distinct across the categories, right? So like I might have a sensory trigger that makes me go kind of into fight or flight, or I might have an evocative cue from a memory of a traumatic incident that tells my nervous system before I'm even consciously aware, hey, go into your protective mode and nervous system activate. What I don't have and what my child does have is neuroception related to whether or not he's equal to, below, or above others, and freedom, choice, and autonomy. That's the primary root cause of what sets off his nervous system. But the mechanisms of the nervous system, the mobilization or immobilization that comes with the perception that we're in danger or that we're going to die, is the same. Right? And that's where we can think about root cause being different at the base, but the mechanisms being the same. So if you're a parent who doesn't identify as PDA, but maybe has experienced panic attacks or has had a nervous system response or has trauma, you may understand the mechanism of the nervous system very well, but maybe not have the same root cause of what sets it off, okay? So there is an element to understanding this that I think every human can relate to because all of us have a nervous system, right? Okay, so what do we know about the nervous system? Up until about 1995, when the first peer-reviewed article was published by Dr. Stephen Porges, who is the sort of father of polyvagal theory, it was mostly thought about in binary terms of like, okay, we're in parasympathetic, which is like safe and social, we're not activated, or we're in sympathetic, which is like fight, flight, freeze, right? And there wasn't a lot that explained some of these shutdown behaviors or appeasement behaviors or fawning behaviors or other nervous system responses that are more complex that have to do with polyvagal theory. Okay, so polyvagal, we can just think of it as like more than one polyvagal. So the vagus nerve, right? There's two pathways for mammals. Okay, so I'm going to make this as simple as possible. My learnings from reading Polyvagal Theory and being in the Polyvagal Certificate course, I'm going to make it as basic as I can to like help it hit the brain centers well. So, and this comes out of our understanding of evolutionary biology as well. So when we think of a reptile, okay, they don't have the ability to be safe and social. Okay, they don't have tribes, they don't need to nurture their live young, they don't breastfeed, all the things. They have eggs, right? And so they just live in fight, flight, freeze. Like you have a reptile who like freezes and their heart rate goes down and their breathing slows and they're just like kind of like in shutdown, right? And they don't have the safe and social that mammals do and have needed in evolutionary terms to down-regulate that response, which means like anytime you see another mammal, knowing through the facial expressions, tones, and movements, like, oh, I'm safe here and I can down-regulate that first vagal pathway and have some mobilization for play, interaction, socialization, but I'm not going to just be in fight, flight, freeze. Okay? So that's the main way I understand it, the difference between like the reptilian single pathway vagus and how mammals evolved through safe and social cues because they needed them to raise their young, to live in like more social environments, to, raise their young, right? And we are mammals. So the other thing that we can think about is these states that are a little bit more complex than just fight, flight, freeze, right? So we have ventral vagal, which just means safe and social. That's the parasympathetic. That's when we can rest, restore, connect, empathize. It's when our body like physiologically restores and recovers. Then we have sympathetic, which is a mobilized state, right? The metabolism speeding up, we're getting adrenaline and cortisol, but it's not necessarily always fight flight, right? For example, play is a hybrid state where we have some mobilization, but we're also down regulating and have some ventral vagal because we're getting the cues that we're safe from another person's face or laughter or their tone, okay? And then we have dorsal, which is the part that is relatively new to polyvagal theory, which is like shut down, collapse. It's the antelope that can't fight flight from the lion. They can't fight a lion, so it's just sort of playing dead or collapsing. And that has a physiological immobilization, which is like heart rate slowing, breathing slowing, blood rushing to the core in case it gets bitten. And it's actually like the physiology changes, just like back when we're thinking about reptiles, how they actually like their temperature drops and their heart rate slows. And like mammals can't stay in dorsal forever because you die. Your heart rate would stop, your breathing would stop, etc. Okay, so what does this more complex understanding of the nervous system that we're really on the cutting edge of? Keep in mind that 2011 is when Dr. Stephen Porges produced his seminal work or book on the theory, and that's not that long ago. Okay, so you and me, all of us, we're here on the cutting edge as parents, learning about this in order to help our children. Casey, how does this theory help us with parenting? Because really, we don't want to be navel gazing, even though personally, I like to engage in academic debate and all those things, but really you and I are here because you want to get to the bottom of some of the paradoxes that you observe with your child or teen. Okay, so here's our first question. Casey, why are things getting worse now that I'm lowering demands, accommodating my child, and sort of going all in on a non-behavioral approach as an experiment to supporting my child who perhaps I've only approached through behavioral approaches, or they've been in, intensive applied behavioral therapy, and I observed as a parent that didn't help. But now things feel like they're getting worse. Let me give you a story about my own life to illustrate this. So when my son went into burnout, he was very much in that mobilized energy, that externalized fight-flight energy. Lots of screaming, lots of throwing things, lots of, expressing the sounds and movements and actions of truly a mammal that was going to die. That's how he was behaving, and that's how his brain was perceiving the situation, even though objectively as a parent, I was doing like normal and typical and quote good parenting things, right? That shouldn't be traumatic, but his brain worked differently. So by the time we sort of hit rock bottom with our trauma cave and I left my career and we were considering putting him in the psychiatric emergency room in the Washington, D.C. area because he just seemed completely out of control. My mother-in-law said, bring him to my house, okay? And just take a breath, So I brought him to her apartment and he went into dorsal. Okay, dorsal meaning immobilization, where it's like pretty much selective mutism, not speaking. He just sort of went into a shell and there wasn't a lot there, right? He was sort of disassociating. He wasn't present. There's a numbing there. And this is a protective mechanism. If we think back to the antelope and the lion, if you're in the lion's jaws, you do not want to be conscious and present of the pain, right? You want to go to that last resort nervous system reaction, which is the body actually acts dead and predators don't eat dead prey. Okay, it sounds extreme, but this is what was going on with my son's body, even though from the outside everything looked, quote, normal. So then when we sort of made some decisions. We decided to move back to Michigan. I left my job like a couple days later and we started to make these big moves. My son came home. He came back out of dorsal and up through his sympathetic energy, right? So one of the things I've learned in this polyvagal training, and this makes total sense to me, and I've worked with clients who had children where this was very present, where the child reaches burnout and goes into complete dorsal. What does that mean? They're lethargic, far away look in their eyes, maybe there's selective mutism, trouble accessing basic needs, maybe they're not able to leave a particular room or on the couch, and they just don't seem there, okay? So that's dorsal, but from the perspective of a parent, that can feel better than once they start to mobilize out of dorsal and start to yell at you, correct you, throw things, scream. But it's actually a sign that they're moving out of that last state, which is hierarchical, right? Like for the polyvagal theory, if they're in dorsal, they have to move back up through fight flight. So in addition to unmasking, there's also, if your child has been in dorsal or totally internalized, there will be some coming out, and that's actually not a bad thing. It's just something to observe and understand through the logic of the polyvagal theory. I'm not discounting like how hard that is when, you know, you were scared for your child, but they weren't aggressive and they weren't throwing things or violent. And then, you know, you start doing an approach that's radically different, and then you start to see more distressing behaviors to you, and you're like, well, this isn't working. So for those of you on the live, or if you're listening to the podcast, I'd love for you to just reflect on this logic. And if you're on this live, just tap a heart or something to let me know, yes, this is resonating, or that you're understanding. Okay. Second question that I get often from parents: how can my PDA child just turn it on and off again, being completely one version of themselves, potentially at school or in a therapy environment or even around their friends, masking, and then a completely different child who's explosive, aggressive, melting down, etc. at home? Truly two different versions of themselves. And here's the nature of this question, and it's such a good one. And I'm noticing this since I've been in the PDA space now for almost 4 years. I've noticed the patterns of like where parents' understanding has evolved to, and brilliantly, you guys are all like, we got the basics, Casey, like, let's figure out the paradoxes, right? So basically, this question stems from, yes, I understand that you're saying cognitively, I can understand that my PDA their behavior isn't under their conscious control. But how is that possible? Like, how is it possible that the nervous system is behaving like this where they're truly two different children? Like, how can it not be under their conscious control? And so one of the things that we're learning in this polyvagal program is how complex the nervous system responses are to keep us protected and alive. And it's the most basic, fundamental drive we have as humans, and it will override everything else. And remember, the root cause is the perception of, am I equal to, above, or below? And if I'm below, I'm going to have that nervous system response of threat. And if I don't have freedom and choice, I'm also going to have that nervous system of reaction of threat. So it's not that your PDA child is consciously turning it on and off. It's that their subconscious brain, which we can call the survival brain, before the cognitive awareness of whether or not a place is safe. Like, they're not going into school and being like, oh, this isn't safe as home where I'm unconditionally loved. So now I'm going to employ these social strategies so that, you know, I'm safer here. It's this part of the brain telling the nervous system one of three things. It's neurocepting one of three things. I'm safe, I'm in danger, or I'm in like mortal danger and gonna die. And so if your child is perceiving, or like not even perceiving, I keep saying perceiving, but what I want to say is neurocepting, pre-perceptual awareness of danger, then their body's going to say, hey, internalize that threat response. Like, don't go into fight or flight because you're just going to get more activation, because you're going to be responded to with restraint, time out, you know, public shaming, sticker charts, which is going to make your nervous system activate more. Instead, let's go into freeze, or instead, let's go into appeasement or fawning, right? Which are hybrid states. So, for example, freeze, we have that mobilization energy of fight, flight, but it's like a deer in the headlights because there's some immobilization, right? So it's not as simple as just like this binary understanding of the nervous system. But the main point here is that what I think matters for your own mindset and work with your children is to remember that this is not a conscious decision, and because it's not coming from a rational part of the brain, if we respond to it with rational behavioral strategies, we can end up making things worse, both in our relationship with them, but also in their cumulative nervous system activation. Okay, so I see from Beth, this is where I get stuck internally. Like, my brain understands the premise, but in daily life with these stark differences around different people and environments, I still get frustrated and confused. Of course you do. And it still creeps up on me. Like, it still gets me. And this is why I always, like, the first place I go back to is like, how does the brain work? How does it work? What part of the brain are we in, right? And even if like my heart and my nervous system are like, I can sort of go back to this logic and be like, okay, nervous system disability, not in the right part of the brain. And then once I'm back to that logic, I can sort of build back my responses and my decisions, okay, to a place where I want to be, where I want to respond. And I will say this takes a lot of practice. These are skills. That's like something that we do in the paradigm shift program, is like move way beyond just like the knowledge, and we actually like implement, which takes time and practice, and you're not alone in that. Okay, third question. How can equalizing behavior be social in nature if it's nervous system driven? Okay, this is a great question, because what did we talk about at the beginning of this training? We talked about ventral vagal, or the safe and social state, being when we are recruiting our social engagement system, or down-regulating our vagus nerve, and we're more likely in that prefrontal cortex, or what we can call the thinking brain. Okay, so this is super confusing, and this gets me back to Beth's comment. Okay, so let me give you an example from my own son and my own experience 4 years ago now, during the very beginning of the pandemic. Okay, so what were we all worried about at the beginning of the pandemic? Like, even before we knew that it was an airborne virus, it was like hand washing, right? And so what did I do as a mom? I doubled down on washing my house and washing my groceries and making my kids wash their hands. But we all know now the logic of a PDA brain, which is like, the more you push them to do something without their consent, the more they perceive a loss of autonomy. Like, Mom, you're taking away my choice of whether or not I can wash my hands. A, and B, you're putting yourself in a position of authority just telling me I have to do this, no matter how rational it is and how needed it is for him to wash his hands during a pandemic. So when I first started asking, and this was pre my depth of understanding of PDA now, so I was, just learning, and I was saying, it's time to wash your hands, honey. And his first avoidance strategy was social, right? Where he would distract. Oh, Mama, I did this thing at school, right? Or he would recruit his social abilities with trying to distract me by pointing to, artwork that he had done, or saying like, well, William hasn't washed his hands. At the time he was like 1.5. So these first responses, these first line nervous system responses looked very behavioral because they were social, right? And looked like they were totally under his conscious control. But what happened? I will double down. No, you need to wash your hands. Like, please don't keep getting distracted. Let's go back to the bathroom. And I would try and corral him. And then I'm using some physicality in this, and he's perceiving even more losses of autonomy and equality, okay? So then he's moving out of that first level of equalizing, and he's saying, stop talking, and correcting what I'm saying, and saying, it's not true, we don't need to wash our hands, right? And then he moved immediately into growling, then going limp, kicking, screaming, and moved all the way up the ladder into like much more fight or flight, and much deeper into that survival part of the brain, okay? But what was going on at the very beginning? And you see, this is part of what makes it so confusing with PDA children who are social, PDA children who are gifted, PDA children who are older and use more verbal equalizing rather than having like a big violent meltdown, which is very like observable, quote unquote, as a parent. He was recruiting his social engagement system. And so before my understanding of polyvagal theory, there wasn't anything really written in the fight, flight, freeze dimension that was about like hybrid states, okay? So in this certificate training, I'm learning about hybrid states. I mentioned one, which is freeze, where you have some mobilization and some immobilization, which is the deer in the headlights. But there's also things like appeasement, okay? So we learned about appeasement being like hyper vigilant and monitoring another person in a position of authority and adjusting behavior as a protective response. So this might happen in a kidnapping situation, it's related to Stockholm syndrome, or even in an abusive relationship, right? This appeasement strategy. So you have mobilization, that fight flight energy, but you also are recruiting the social engagement system as part of the protective response. Okay, so what I'm learning and how I believe it applies to PDA is, just because there is some recruitment of ventral vagal safe and social system doesn't mean that that is mutually exclusive from this being a nervous system response. I have known intuitively and I have believed that this is not under the conscious control of our children for a long time. However, I am stumbling upon the most cutting edge research or theory that can explain this. So I'm just excited to share it with you guys here. Okay, last question, and then we'll wrap it up and say goodbye. This is one that I'm currently experiencing, and I hope that some of you, this will resonate, especially if you've been around with me for a long time on my page or taken one of my programs. So maybe you've done a low demand approach, you've really refined the accommodations, you've made lots of cost benefit decisions to stabilize your family, and you do truly feel at peace with the decisions you've made and your identity as a parent. And this is where I am now, and I hope many of you are there or on your way. However, maybe your nervous system feels worse than it did 3 years ago, and you're like, what the hell? My family's actually doing great or much better than they were. I have a better sense of my direction and identity as a parent. Why do I feel so terrible in my body and in my nervous system? So this is something that I have of late and recently over the last 2 years experienced where, and I've become very aware of it through some of the nervous system work I've done, whether it's through the Havening protocol, EMDR work, I'm currently doing somatic experiencing, etc. I did the Safe and Sound protocol twice, but this is sort of like a frustrating feeling because when I think back to the pandemic, when I was a full-time caregiver, had no support, obviously no au pair, no service dog, all the things that we've set up now, I perceive that I actually felt better in some ways. And, I think my husband would argue with that because he saw from the outside looking in. But as I tune in more to my body and my own nervous system responses and have the space to heal, it feels very crunchy because it's like, why am I so freaking sensitive, and why am I having this mobilization when everything is fine? Like objectively everything is fine and actually quite good in my life. I mean, we all have things, right? Like my mom just finished chemo and like I get anxious, all the things. But from our baseline, things are good. And how I've come to understand it is that like I was pretty much in dorsal and disassociating for like a couple years in there, right? When I was in the trauma cave. And that means when you're in dorsal and shutting down, like you often have endorphins released, you're disassociating, so you're not as like acutely aware of what's going on in your body, you're numbed out, and I would fall asleep very easily because my body would just shut down from that experience. But then when you're doing the work for yourself, when you finally find that space, you are also moving up through mobilization and fight or flight and like experiencing all the parts of your nervous system that necessarily were turned off during that traumatic time where you truly just had to be in survival mode. So this, I hope, gave you guys a mini training on polyvagal theory and how it applies to us as parents and raising a PDA child or teen in the current world that we live in. I'm glad you guys were here. I hope you're having a good day, and I will be here again soon. All right, my friends, bye. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.